Hello, my name is Tom Faller, and I've been an amateur astronomer for about 45 years. I do a lot of work at star parties, showing people the stars, planets, and moons through my telescope here. And a lot of questions that I get about it usually start off with, how much is that telescope? And people are sometimes pretty disappointed when I tell them. But I also have to tell them, this is not the kind of telescope you want to start with. For one thing, it's heavy. It takes me about 15 minutes to set up and then 15 minutes to tear down and put it back in the car. And finally, it takes batteries. You don't want that in a beginner's telescope. You want something that's light, that's easy to carry from your house, put it outside in your backyard or your front yard, or throw it in the car, and be set up almost instantaneously. The reason I carry this one around is because if I'm going to use it with 100 people tonight, I know that nobody's going to tip it over. So there's a difference between an intermediate telescope and a beginning telescope. I'm going to talk about beginning telescopes, and I want to keep us in a range of about, say, $100 to $300. This is because most of the telescopes I've seen that are below $100 have some compromises or shortcomings. There's something that would actually cause you to spend about as much to fix that telescope as you put into it originally. So we want to keep within a budget that gives you some control over how good the telescope is without having to worry about fixing it all the time. Above $300, we're getting into a different class of telescope. It's got more capability, but it also has a lot more complication. So we've got a limit, we can stay within that limit, and we can still find something that would please everybody. My priority here is to find something that you'll be thrilled with, because being thrilled is the major part of using a telescope in astronomy. And anything that gets in the way of that is a complication that we should try and eliminate. A telescope is a system of three things: the tube, the mount, and the eyepiece. The mount is as important as the tube, and we'll talk about why in a minute. The tube determines what you can see, and the eyepiece determines how satisfied you're going to be with looking at it. All of these work together. So instead of making specific recommendations based on a manufacturer's name, I'm going to show you how they work and how they come together, and then let you pick out a combination that will satisfy you and keep you using that telescope. So let's see how this works. To see Saturn's rings clearly, or to see Jupiter's bands and its moons, or to look at small features and craters on the moon, the kind of things that keep you coming back, you need at least 80 power of magnification from your telescope. So let's discuss how to get that. You need to know two things from this. You need the focal length of your telescope and the focal length of your eyepiece. The focal length of your telescope is usually printed on a little certificate on the side of the telescope, and the eyepiece always has the focal length, because that's how you determine the magnification. Focal lengths are given in millimeters, and 1,000 millimeters is a meter, which is about the size of a yard. So you can use the little patch that's on your telescope, or you can just kind of eyeball it. This telescope is about a 700 millimeter focal length telescope, and it has a 10 millimeter eyepiece in it. To get the effective magnification, you divide the focal length of the telescope by that of the eyepiece. So 700 divided by 10 is 70 power. That's pretty easy. What makes this easier is that the focal length of your telescope never changes. To change the magnification, you change eyepieces. And to make this even easier, most telescopes come with 2 and only 2 eyepieces. You add any more complications in by buying more eyepieces. They mostly have, say, a 20 or 25 millimeter for the low power and a 10 power for the high power. So with a 700 millimeter telescope, you have 20 millimeters into 700 is 35 power. That's the low power eyepiece. 10 millimeters, again, is 70 power. For another telescope, it's going to be different, but each telescope, remember, keeps its same focal length, and as you move your eyepieces from one telescope to another, you'll change power slightly. Now, you could apparently take this and go up to 1,000,000 power just by choosing the right eyepiece, but in practical terms, there's a rule of thumb, and that's for every inch of objective of your telescope, you get about 30 power maximum. Now, what's an inch of objective? This is a 2-inch telescope right here. That lens is 2 inches or 50 millimeters across. 1 inch is 25 millimeters. So 2 inches is 50, 3 inches is 75, 4 inches is 100 millimeters. That's about as big as you're going to get on most amateur telescopes. So this telescope gives you about 60 power maximum. That's not quite enough to get a good view of Saturn. This telescope, on the other hand, is a 3-inch scope, so that gives you about 90 power. You'd be able to see Saturn's rings clearly with this, which, I've taken the scope out, yes you can. We can go into this for other telescopes, but that's the basics. That's the whole idea behind magnification and your eyepieces. Now let's talk about eyepieces a little bit. Let's talk for a minute about the kinds of eyepieces you can expect to get with a small beginner's telescope. Eyepieces come in 3 sizes. 0.965. This is 96/100th of an inch across. 1.25 inches, slightly larger, and then finally 2-inch eyepieces. 2-inch eyepieces are for very wide field, low power views, and they are typically not found on any beginner telescope, so we can just leave these off. What you'll see a lot on beginner telescopes are the 0.965 eyepieces. And these are mostly in designs that come out of the last century. Huygens, they'll have a little H on them, they'll have an SR or an MA or something like that. They're very inexpensive. They're very hard to look through, especially if you have glasses. If you see the specifications for a telescope and it comes with any of these kind of 0.965 eyepieces, pass. The reason is that an adapter to get you up to a 1¼ inch eyepiece and then buying new eyepieces is going to cost you more than the telescope itself. So let's just concentrate for the moment on the 1¼ eyepieces. You can see they come in all sizes and shapes. The ones you will probably get with your telescope, if you're buying it for under $300, are going to be a 10 millimeter and a 20 millimeter. Remember, the 20 millimeter is the lower power, wider field of view. 10 millimeter is high power. You remember how to find the magnification by dividing it into the focal length of the telescope. You'll find that most of the eyepieces that you get are going to be of one particular type called a plossel. Try and look for that in the specifications. Plossel is a strange name, but it's been popular with telescopes since about the 80s because of its low cost and its good optical qualities. They present very nice views. This is worth upgrading to a better telescope for. You'll be much more pleased with the view from a plossel eyepiece than you will from any of the cheaper ones. Now, I've seen a trend recently where they replace the lower power eyepiece with something called a Kellner eyepiece. Kellners were used as an inexpensive eyepiece up until about the 80s, and then Plössls completely replaced them. But they're sneaking back in. Why? They're lower cost to the manufacturers. This isn't a deal breaker. Kellners aren't that bad, but Plössls are significantly better. They'll give you a wider field of view and fewer optical problems. So if yours comes with a Kellner, see what kind of deal it is. One more thing that you used to see all the time but is becoming a little bit more rare is something called a Barlow lens. Barlows are basically just a little negative lens in a tube, and they fasten onto the eyepiece like that. And what this does is cuts the focal length of your eyepiece in half. So a 10 millimeter focal length becomes a 5 millimeter. That effectively doubles the power of that eyepiece. So for a 700 millimeter focal length telescope with a 10 millimeter eyepiece, you would get 70 power. With a Barlow lens, double that for 140 power. This all sounds good. You get much more power. You can see things more clearly, especially on the moon. Trouble is, if you have a small diameter aperture on your telescope, closer to 3 inches, you might run out of light using this. But it's not a big deal. Again, this is just one of the accessories you can look for and how to tell when you're probably getting a good deal on a small telescope. So next is the mount. Mounts are about the most important thing with a small telescope. It has to be able to find things and move to them cleanly and then not have any backlash. You have to be able to track the object you're looking at smoothly as it moves through the night sky, because even something like the moon, which is easy to find, will actually move out of the field of your telescope in just a few minutes, and you have to be able to move the telescope to follow it. So there are some mounts that are good mounts and some that are not so good, and we'll look at those now. The first one is the really, really low-cost mount, and you find these on really inexpensive telescopes. They're for tabletops, but the problem with this mount, this is as high as it goes. You can't point at anything farther up in the sky. It's got problems too. The objective's only 2 inches, which means you can only get up to 60 power, and it uses 0.965 eyepieces, which we just discussed as being unsatisfactory. So, too bad. The next kind of mount you'll see an awful lot, and that's called an alt-azimuth. This lets you move up and down in the sky and move around. And it's not too bad, and in this case it's bundled with a fairly good, respectable telescope that uses 1 1/4 eyepieces. But it's got one problem. It doesn't balance the telescope at all, which means you need a extra little support bar here when you're trying to move it, and as you can see, that support bar doesn't move cleanly. So every time you move the telescope, you'll be fighting this. This is not a great scope because of that, and because the legs are kind of light, they'll start to break fairly quickly. There's a lot of ads for these out there, so if you see your telescope mount has one of these little bars in it, go to something else. You'll be a lot happier. The third type of mount is called the camera mount, and this looks like it comes on a camera tripod. This is a nice sturdy mount. Doesn't move very much with the wind, but there's a problem. Once you start pointing it up at things in the sky, it gets unbalanced. Watch. You don't want that to happen in the dark. There are better mounts. Two types of telescope mounts are worth considering for a beginner. One of them is the equatorial mount, which this is a large example of an equatorial mount. There are smaller ones that are less expensive and better for beginners. The great thing about this is once the polar axis here is aligned with the star Polaris, then you can take this and point it at something and just move one axis the whole night. You can track whatever it is in the sky just with one push. Very easy. This type of mount also usually has better bearings than most of the other mounts. And the aluminum legs will extend, so you can raise it so that you can use the eyepiece comfortably. Great advantage. Let's look at the other kind. The other type of mount is the Dobsonian mount. It's made only for Newtonian type reflecting telescopes, and it doesn't track the sky, but it has very large bearings and it's very smooth. You can move it very easily, track the sky very easily with just a push, and it stays where you put it. There's no backlash. So this is a very smooth and easy mount and great for beginners. Another feature about this is it's very low cost and easy to make, so that typically for the same type of telescope and mount you get a bigger mirror than a refracting telescope and a cheaper mount than the Equatorial mount. There are three main types of telescope. One is a refractor. This has a lens at the front of the tube and your eyepiece is at the back. Another one has a mirror. This is a reflector. The mirror is back here. Light comes in, goes down the tube, back up, and hits a little diagonal mirror just inside the front end and bounces out to the eyepiece up here. And the third has both mirrors and lenses. This is called a Cassegrain type of mount. And it has a big lens on front, a mirror on back, another mirror mounted on the back of the lens, and then finally the eyepiece is at the back. As you might expect, these are a little bit more complicated, and so they're a little pricier. They're also heavier than these other two. So for under $300, we're not going to consider these. We'll keep to the refractors and reflectors. Reflectors have a slight advantage over refractors in that you only have to grind one side of a glass mirror to perfection. So they can be made cheaper and they can be made a little larger for the same price opening as a refractor. That means that you can get all the way up to a 4 or 6 inch reflector for the same price as a 3 to 4 inch refractor. However, refractors have a slight edge in quality because there's nothing in the middle of your light path. Also, these are more of a traditional scope, and a lot of people feel that unless they have a refractor, it's not really a telescope. There are a few differences in the mounting. Both of these will go on the same type of Equatorial mount. This can go on a Dobsonian mount and stay fairly close to the ground. If you have a long refractor, you're going to have to think about how high your telescope mount is, or you'll be spending the whole night with your head next to the ground. But otherwise, they're pretty close. Now, if you get any type of telescope, you will probably want to get a finder scope with it. And a lot of these come with a really basic small finder scope that you look through. It's got a slight crosshair in the middle. You can actually see that against the background light in the sky. You point that at the same thing that the main telescope is pointing at before you start, and that way this has a wider field of view, almost like binoculars, and you can see a lot more stuff around what you're trying to find. Once you find it and get it in the crosshairs, then the main telescope is also looking at the same thing. Finder telescopes come in sizes all the way up to binocular size. This is about a 9 by 50. And it's very useful. It gives you enough magnification, plus it gives you enough field of view to find things easily. The third one that I have is something new. It's called a red dot finder. This is electronic. You turn it on, it projects a small red dot to the middle of a little window here. And as long as that's aligned with your telescope, then it's working the same way as an optical finder will. These are coming back on a lot of scopes because they're cheaper for manufacturers to make, but I warn you, they're not cheaper for you to use because they use watch batteries. And for some reason, I always forget to turn these off at the end of the night, and then the batteries are dead for the next session. And watch batteries are just not that cheap. Finally, I've had my telescopes for years. I've had one 8-inch telescope for over 30 years now, and I still use it. It's still working. I've had this telescope for well over a dozen years, and I still take it out and use it. If you have only $100 to spend, I think that any of the choices that we have suggested today will be good for you. You'll have a satisfying telescope that you can use for a long time. But if you decide to put a little bit more money into it and get up in the $200 to $300 range, you'll have a telescope that will keep you satisfied and thrilled with the night sky and will encourage you to get further into astronomy for a long time. My feeling is that a lot of people get into astronomy and lose interest in it, not because they can't really find anything, but because their telescope is so difficult to use. And I hope that we've shown you today how to get around that and get a telescope that is easy enough so that you can see things in the sky and enjoy them. You'll also have the pride of being able to go to, say, a star party and say, hey, look what I found. This is what I hope to leave you with today. Thank you for watching.